Welcome, everyone. My name is Adriana Machado. I'm the founder of BRIA Institute, a benefit corporation in the US that bridges innovation, practice, and purpose to inspire leaders to transform organizations and co-create an impact economy. So what do I mean by impact economy? That which pursues financial returns alongside positive impact for people and planet. So yes, it's possible. BRIA is just an example of what we can do, what business can do to be a force for good. So this webinar is the 11th of BRIA and the 4th of a series that we call the Era of Leadership. Now is the time for us all to embrace our unique leadership journeys wherever we are. So it doesn't matter if it's a big or small company, the size doesn't matter. What matters is the mindset. And the mindset that I invite you to cherish in this year, 2021 and on, is that of questioning what is, really, challenging the status quo. I think there is a great opportunity to allow individuals and the collective to raise, to evolve, to build new narratives, to create new worldviews that will be more inclusive. And so I propose that we shift our mindsets, the way we think, from less linear and fragmented to more systemic and holistic, and also to look for the interconnections, to look to integrate, to regenerate systems that are not working, and to also address topics as important as the one we're talking about today, which is diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So it is my honor to be joined today by Adele, Enang, and Pedro. So let me start by welcoming our guests. So Adele Vrana is an Afro-Brazilian feminist and social justice activist who advocates for a decolonized internet where people like her can be fully visible, heard, and affirmed. She is the former director of strategic partnerships at the Wikimedia Foundation and a 2015 Erasmus Prize laureate on behalf of her work to expand access to knowledge in the Global South. Currently, Adele is the co-founder and co-director of Whose Knowledge, a global campaign working to redesign the internet by centering the leadership of marginalized communities to create, collect, and curate their own knowledge online. So welcome, Adele. Great to have you. Enang Ukoh is a Nigerian living in Toronto, Canada, and leading the role of senior associate at Brand Active, a rebrand consulting firm. When she isn't managing projects and developing rebrand strategies, she's working on her venture, Lavendam. Lavendam is a collective of young professionals supporting each other through the journey of adulthood, through peer learning and shared experiences, building sustainable communities and fostering spaces for lifelong knowledge sharing. This is her passion and how she hopes to make a difference in the world. So welcome, Enang. It's great to have you with us. Last but not least, Pedro Suarez, an Argentine-American senior executive who has led 30-plus year career in Dow Inc., where he played the roles of Latin America President, North America President, and more recently, Chief Commercial Officer for the company globally. Pedro has been committed to top priorities, which include improving leadership capabilities, redefining the customer experience, and delivering bottom-line impact in a global organization. Pedro is also an investor, a member of several board of directors, including the BRIA Institute, which I'm honored. So thank you so much, Pedro, for helping us at BRIA and for being with us today. Welcome. All right, so let's start with the why. This is so important. Like Simon Sinek reminds us all the time, right? Why is diversity and inclusion important? Why are we discussing this topic to begin with? And I'll begin with Pedro. Pedro, your thoughts, please.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a great question. I know that sometimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, sometimes generate some challenging questions and misunderstanding in the organization. So that's why I think it's important to hopefully clarify this during this conversation. I think in simple terms, nature is giving us a great example of diversity because each and every one of the species, independently of the size, of the color, they all play a role in the performance of the planet, and also particularly and more important on the survival of the planet. So obviously taking that example into the business world is a little bit more complex, but I think it's important and very beneficial to see several important, very high reputation institutions, consultants that have been researching in this topic and understanding and collecting data on why this is important. And there are institutions like Harvard University and McKinsey and BCG, some other very important institutions that give us a great example. So I'm going to mention some of them and hopefully illustrate how important is diversity and inclusion for the performance of a company. One important thing that everybody is pursuing is innovation. We know that innovation is fueling growth. You don't innovate, you don't grow. And certainly when you have different people around the table trying to design new products and new solutions, certainly you're going to have much better ideas. And data shows that the companies that have that diversity on the innovation engine is producing 19% more sales than those that are not having that kind of diversity. Also very important is everybody wants to have the best talents or recruit the best talents in the market. And data shows that almost 70% of the job seekers are preferring companies that have real diversity and inclusion in their organization. And I'm underlining real, concrete actions on diversity and inclusion. Almost 70% of the job seekers. So if you want to have the best people, you need to have clear diversity and inclusion, or I should say inclusion and diversity better in your organization. Another important topic for any company that wants to have success is to have people engagement. And clearly, when you have diversity in your organization, you have more people engagement. And what is important that those companies that have the diversity and consequently higher people engagement, they outperform by 50%, 50, the companies that don't have that diversity in this people engagement. Last but not least, when you talk about gender, when you have the appropriate gender on the top of the company, it's clearly, and this is data showing that the return to the shareholders, which is obviously a critical goal for any private and public company, is 34% better than those companies that don't have that perspective in the top of the company. So in a nutshell, companies that are practicing and clear and real inclusion and diversity in the organization, they are growing faster, they are returning better, they are more sustainable, and most important, they are having a lot of fun.
Excellent. So one why or one do for diversity is it's good for the bottom line. So let's wake up, right? And get the right model in place that makes sense for your business, but let's, make sure we use it, we apply it, right, Pedro?
Otherwise, you are watching another channel.
Correct. Thank you so much, Pedro. Adele, how about you? What's your take on why?
Yeah, I just wanted to start by thanking you again for the invitation, Adriana and Brain Institute. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be here with Enang and Pedro as well. And I really love that we started with the why and the pragmatics that Pedro, right, like just shared with us. I think for me, I also want to add to the why the necessity of looking back, looking to our past and looking at inequities that have then translated into the workplace, right? If we don't have representative workplaces with the diversity and inclusion that we need, is because there's something, right, that informed that. So looking back and looking at the past inequalities that have created this gender gap, the lack of brown and Black people in the workplace and positions of power in the leadership, LGBTQI, disabled communities, indigenous communities as well, right? And I know we're going to talk about all this multi identities, right, that are marginalized, that are not the minority. We actually are the majority of the world in numbers, but we are marginalized in identities. And what I think it's really important in the terms of the do's for the why is that we are looking at this past inequalities and we are including equity in the frame. So right now, a lot of the organizations, the companies are doing, right, like diversity and inclusion and doing some of the same old same and trying like for the easy answers. But this is a complex problem, right, to solve, or this is a complex issue to tackle. So there's no actually easy answers. There's a lot of what Pedro is saying. The commitment has to be serious and has to be practical, but it needs to affect power. And we are going to also talk about leadership and the role of the leadership, the role of cultural change. But if there's not a change in the power dynamics, in who you are hiring, for which positions you are hiring, then you are not doing the do that you need to do for this, right? So it is really changing the frame to include equity, which means you are making changes around power and who is sitting at the table, who is being the decision making. So this is a strong do for me.
Thank you, Adele. So changing the input to make sure we get a different output. So if we don't change the way we hire or promote or lead to the senior roles, we're not going to get there, right?
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Adele. Enang, what's your take on the why?
Thank you. Definitely going to piggyback off what both Pedro and Adele have said so far, because I think it's super important to consider the role that having a more diverse team plays in the future of work and how we function. I mean, the way our society looks today, especially if you live in a larger city, our societies they're not unicultural. We don't have one single culture that everyone aligns to and snaps to. We all look different. We all make different buying decisions, and the customers you're selling to are very different and diverse people. And so we want to have people who are making decisions that reflect those people that you're trying to sell to ultimately. Something that Pedro had touched on that I just want to expand on even further is just the value of having real diversity and real inclusion and real equity, because a lot of times it ends up being very performative, where we have on paper, we say that we're hiring for a more diverse team and we say that we want to, pull these people in, but are we actually creating opportunities for people to have their voices heard and actually add value to the conversation, make a serious impact in those positions. So just considering the ways that we work with people of diverse backgrounds and social identities in our workplace ultimately impacts the way that we live in the world and the way that we sell in the world. So coming back to the whole concept of having an impact-driven economy is just really starting to think about things from that perspective of we're all people. And so we need to have people who reflect that on the inside and the outside.
Yeah, there's this old saying that is getting more repeated these days, that you have to invite to the party, but ask to dance. So give the position of power and the voice to diversity, correct?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anand. All right, so let's take the temperature of our audience. I always like to know what our audience thinks about when we are doing this webinar. So I have a poll for you. And so since we started discussing the why, let's see here. If diversity and inclusion in the workplace has not reached the level of importance and effectiveness that it should have, if you had to choose the main cause, what would it be? Lack of clear understanding, poor leadership, or inconsistent implementation of the policies? What do you think? Let's give it another minute here for you to vote. And voila, more people here, 53% of our audience think that it's lack of clear understanding. 26% think it's due to poor leadership, and 21% think it's because of inconsistent implementation. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing your thoughts with us. It's good to see that you are also engaged in this conversation. So speaking of leadership, let me go here to more questions to our beautiful panelists. So one extremely important factor to assure that we make progress towards diversity and inclusion is leadership. So what about it? Let's start with Pedro again. Pedro, what about leadership?
By the way, thank you for the beautiful panelists. I think that goes to Enang and Adele. So, and I agree. So anyway, leadership, I think that clearly the audience is clear on this. You know, leadership need to be understanding the importance of diversity and inclusion on the performance of the organization, either be the CEO or be the commercial director or the production leader. And in order to do that, she needs to understand what are the unconscious bias, because, you know, I think Enang mentioned that we are all different, and biases are all over the places, and most of the time you don't know. So you need to understand that, and also you need to understand how to manage your biases, and then and getting closer to the different people, and understand, have a good learning of the best practices, and understanding on how you can put together a diverse team. And I think this is not easy. I think it's important that we offer training, and this is a constant evolution and constant learning and understanding. So, but the most important thing is you need to be convinced, and you need to be committed to do something about you know, inclusion and diversity. And one thing that you cannot do is to add diversity, put a team of different colors, and think that this is gonna bring you better performance, even though you are making the decisions with a small group of people that you like and probably are pretty much like you. And then, you know, you're gonna have the opposite effect. You're gonna have lower performance, in fact. So that's why I think it's important that having everybody in your team dancing, going to your slogan. And the other thing I believe is important is for leaders to be very conscious is, do not believe that the people will follow you based on what you say, but based on what you do. And then, you know, it is a phenomenal step on credibility when you really do what you think you should do. And particularly when you are breaking some of the things that the company or the organization was doing for many years, and you do it differently, because this is the only way to get to the diversity that you are looking for. Making changes that are different than, you know, the customs that we have in the past. Then people are going to say, "Whoa, this person, this leader is really changing, is really committed." So then, you know, the organization will follow you.
Thank you, Pedro. Like you said, being a role model, and I remember when I met you, I considered you a role model for diversity and inclusion.
Thank you.
Great, Latin America. So having commitment, being convinced, being aware. So those are very important conditions for leaders to be able to actually do the right thing.
Definitely.
Well, how about you? You also brought some important aspects in the first question regarding the narratives, but also equity, right? Being needed to be in the mix. So the clear understanding of what's behind. Please elaborate on that.
Yes, and I think I would love to go back to your analogy of the party, right? So it's about, right, like then having the invitations to attend the party and then being able, right, like to then be part of the table that is, right, like savoring in the delicious food of the party or invited to be dancing at the party. But I think what is important when we're thinking about, and that's the definition for diversity and equity, right? You have a diverse range of social identities attending the party, and then they are participating in that party, right? Like as part of the inclusion. When we're thinking about equity, we're going beyond. You are going to have the people that really constitutes the beauty of humanity and how diverse we are, actually being part of the committee that organizes the party. Right? And they are going to be then thinking, what can we do to have better invitation, to be able to have a language in our invitation that attracts, right? Like all types of folks that we want to have in this party. What are the food requirements that we want to have, right? Like to attend all the tastes. So if you, and that's my analogy, to be bringing the equity and also the leadership, right? Because when you are not doing performative leadership, you are actually mentoring and hiring leaders that do not look like you, right? And those leaders are going to have the power to then implement the policies and practices that are going to in turn make your business more diverse and inclusive. If you are centralizing that power and you are not sharing that, and you are not really making sure that your leaders that do not look like you have the power to implement that, you're probably not going anywhere. And that's why leadership is important. And that's why equity is important too, because it is about sharing the power, and sharing the power to probably someone that did not have opportunities in life that you had. Is sharing the power in identifying that even the not knowing, right? Like we talked about this here, and Pedro, I think, mentioned, right? Like you have to then have the trainings, you have to educate yourself. Yes, because if you are probably in the position that, why does this need it, right? Like, why do I need all these people here? Then you do need to start educating yourself first. And that is really key for any leader, because a leader is like looking at what's happening outside of the organization, where the world is going, where are the trends, what is it that I need to be tuned in, right? Like to have the vision for that business. So if they're looking outside of the organization, they will know that the world today do not allow the companies, the business, right? Like that want to succeed, to not be thinking in terms of real equity, diversity, and inclusion. Like it's not even a choice anymore. And I think for the years to come, it's going to be even more true, right? Like right now, companies are exposed on social media when they do make mistakes, when they do not really practice all this real, right, like policies. So it is a matter of vision, right? Like for any leader to be considering that and to be actually acting practically and with real purpose and commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Perfect. So we've discussed here at another webinar at RIA about the citizen stakeholder. It's much easier now for people to demonstrate their opinion about a reputation of a company through social media. So people are watching and are more powerful to also express their opinions. So sharing the power, training, educating. So some companies are doing that, but not quite the right way. And Enang, please, I know you have a lot of experience with that. So how about the right way to do it for leaders?
Yes. So in just listening to the conversation so far, like there's definitely a lot that can be done in terms of leaders taking ownership, educating themselves, being more proactive. But then the trap that we can sometimes fall into is like diversity washing, if you will, where it becomes very tokenistic. Like, okay, what KPIs are you setting is, I guess, the first question. If your KPI is just, let's hire people of color at X percentage, X percentage, X percentage, that's fine. Now you have a more diverse looking team. However, you haven't actually made any tangible changes internally to include those people more actively in decision making. And so part of what that is, and this comes into innovation and how you actually start to build a team that can create lasting change, is in accepting that as the leader, you're not going to have all the answers. And so sometimes you need to empower your team to teach you the things that you don't know. So have those open conversations, have opportunities for teams to share, and believe them when they say that something's going wrong, right? Because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to hear, where everyone kind of gets up in arms. It's like, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not homophobic. However, if somebody who is in a marginalized group is coming to you and saying, I don't feel comfortable in this meeting to share my perspective, or I don't feel comfortable in this particular setting to participate more actively. Not that I don't have any good ideas, I just don't feel comfortable bringing that forward. How can you modify the space that they are in to allow for the value that that person has to bring to the table? And what I've found that's worked really well really is just creating more opportunities for sharing. Let people bring their full selves to work without repercussion. Because if people feel like, okay, if I bring this portion of myself to work, I might be told that I'm being too abrasive, I might be told that I'm being too difficult, then they're going to modify how they're showing up, and you're not going to get the best out of that person, right? So creating more safe spaces for people to show up at work and feel like they're bringing their authentic selves, and they can bring the fullness of their creativity and ideas to that space. And then that's how you start to get the best out of the people.
Beautiful. So spaces to share, and share doesn't necessarily mean putting everybody together, because there are different kinds of diversity. You might have to create spaces that are also reflective of that diversity, right?
Absolutely.
So speaking of that, creating spaces for diversity and inclusion, I would love to also bring a topic here. Sometimes we don't even understand the aspects of diversity, right? So I think we've touched it a little bit in the beginning, but let's go back here and talk about these different kinds of diversity that exist. So Enang, I'll go back to you about creating the spaces. How can we be mindful of that?
Yes. So one way that I've figured that's worked really well is, first of all, having that be led organically through the people who are actually in this space. So oftentimes you might find like people who are of the same race, may bond together, especially if there's a smaller group of them at a certain workplace. You may see that those caucuses will naturally form. But how we can be more intentional is also just by being clued into what social identity looks like in overall. And so there are multiple verticals that you can define social identity, and there's also intersectionality that builds into that, where, for example, I'm a Black woman who's also an immigrant. And so my Blackness, or my race, my gender identity, my immigration into a different country, the language that I speak, these are all things that intersect to form my identity. And so how I show up in the workplace is largely informed by all of these little verticals that shape who I am. And so just being conscious about what those things are. So like I said, there's race, there's gender, there's sexuality, there's religion, there's language, there's culture, there's ability. There's so many different things that start to form who we see ourselves as and how we show up in a social context. And so just staying clued into those different verticals is definitely very helpful in starting to craft those spaces that would be ideal for people to feel safe in.
Nice, thank you. And that reminds me of language. I got an article, very interesting article from a friend the other day talking about ableist words. And I wasn't even aware that I was using words like blind spots. And that could be offensive to a blind person. And I didn't realize that. But this could be so overwhelming sometimes, because there are so many words that we're used to using that are not appropriate to certain groups of people. So Pedro, what's your take on this language issue that we have and growing the awareness in the corporate world?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's fundamental to speak to the others with respect and being conscious about the sometimes the wording that we are using, and we don't realize that can be sensitive for some people, and so we need to understand that and figuring out how to relate with the other people in a correct way. And I think we need to go beyond that. Once we understand the right wording and how this is coming from and what are the sensitivities, I think we need to use that knowledge to get closer to the different networks and different people. So, that knowledge will allow us to understand better what are the issues, what are the needs, what are the claims. So, for any leader, getting closer to that particular differences that the leader don't understand, I think it's critical for you to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, we are having this program on diversity, but we were not taking into consideration these kind of things that I learned today, because I was able to communicate in an open manner, in a respectful manner, with people that are different than me, and now we understand. So it could be the right way, the right language could give you a phenomenal vehicle for you to connect and learn. And then, being in a position of leaders to go back and say, okay, we were wrong on this, we got to change this, or we need to modify this, or maybe the program that we have, we were not covering these other needs that, so then, we were not taking advantage of these group of people that are eager to participate if we have the right conditions. So I think definitely we need to be conscious. We need to, I'm happy that all these things are coming up, because, I think it's, again, a source of learning. But, my comment here is be careful not to stay just knowing that and being politically correct. Use that language to get closer, understand, and act.
Right, and feel the pain. This is something that we've discussed before, and you have used this to feel the pain of that person that's different from you and be able to act as a leader.
Exactly.
Thank you, Pedro. Adele, we also touched this subject in the previous webinar about the privilege, me being in a position of privilege, so I don't see certain things. Can you elaborate a little bit more for our audience about privilege?
Yes. And I think it's really coming to well with, right, like something that Enang was saying, she brought up the intersectionality, right, like of the identities. And I'm really glad we're talking about this, because we are not, right, like many of us have these intersections, right? And therefore we need to be thinking about them. I'm not only a woman, I'm a Black woman, I am an immigrant, right? Like all these identities come together when we're thinking about policy and what to do. So that's really, really important. And we also talked about, right, like education and talking, right, like talking to a person that do not look like us or do not have the same, right, like abilities, or do not really walk in the world the way we walk in the world. And one thing that I want to mark here is that it's a privilege not to know, right? It's a privilege not to have felt and be on the other end of racism, more sexism, more homophobia. And we need to start our own, any one of us, right? Like we all have these biases. We all, right, like carry this. And we do need to self-reflect and educate ourselves and not expect that the other, right, like the person that we are trying to understand and learn from, have the job, is not their job to educate us, right? Like there's so many resources inside the workplace and outside of the workplace. There's like lots and lots of information and knowledge around us online, in physical spaces, that we can draw from without burdening the people that are already, right, like really, really tired of explaining why it's hard, right, like to be on the other receiving end of racism, sexism, and etc., right? So let's not burden the people that we are trying to, right, like include and get and have around us, and really do the self, right, like the self-educating, the educating. And then of course, if they're open to it, if they want to share, it's really rich to be in conversations, but just let's come with the awareness of that we have that privilege.
Thank you. And I would like to complement with one concrete example that happened in a group where both of us participate that made some of us uncomfortable. So it was a women's networking group called MIDAS. And when the Black Lives Matters movement struck, we felt the need to invite more women of color. And you were the one, some of the MIDAS that started this movement, you got invited and you invited more MIDAS. And then when the situation got really tense, at some point, the Black MIDAS decided to create a group of their own. And some of the other MIDAS, including myself, felt uncomfortable because we were thinking, oh, but they are excluding themselves from the group by creating this separate group. And I felt very uncomfortable, but talking to you, I understand it now. So can you explain to our audience why this is important and what is the difference? That's not exclusion.
Yes, no, it's not. And it is important, as we've touched earlier here, to create safe spaces, right? Like the fact that we as Black MIDAS, we needed our safe space where we could really talk about our experiences in a way that, right, like we can use shorthand. We understand, we have been there, right? They have felt my pain, I have felt their pain, and we needed that. At the same time, it's important to have, right, like these spaces where we are also sharing with the broader MIDAS, that we're really bringing them, right, like what are the pain points for us? And then we have, right, like the broader conversations. So I don't really think this is a binary, right, choice. It's not either or. We need to have the space for both. And translating that to the workplace is the same, right? Like when we have organically led and created, right, like employee groups, they need to have that safe space, which is usually really helpful, right? But at the same time, if they have demands that they want to put to the leadership, having leadership that is then willing to come onto those meetings and understand and listen, as Enang said, right? Like then you are open to the demands or to the claims or to the complaints that group has, and then you can problem solve from there. So have this two spaces, talking to each other, but then respecting that they need to sometimes coexist independently. It's really important.
Yes, and that reminds me of the properties of a system. So if we are, dealing with complexity, we need to be thinking more like systems thinkers. And the three properties are belonging. So feeling that you belong, having that common trait. The other one is exchange. So having the safe space, like Enang was saying, to exchange. You give something, you receive something. And also the order, when sometimes more experienced people can allow others to have a voice, but they create the safe space for others to take over and have their voice expressed. So it's not either or. I totally agree with you, Adele. Thank you for explaining to us. We have many questions coming from our audience. I'm so excited. But before we go there, I wanted to also ask a question to Pedro about the situation in the corporate world where usually the top decides, right? Oh, let's do it. We have to include and we have to do so many things. The priorities are like many, but the middle management is the one who has to implement and feel crushed with so many important things to do. Pedro, what's your take on that? What's your advice? What happens here with the middle management that we can make them effective?
That is certainly crucial. I think you may have a phenomenal understanding on the top, and you can have a great program, but the middle management, the ones that need to implement, and this part of the organization is fundamental. And in fact, they are kind of a funneling all the initiatives and priorities of the company. And sometimes they feel overwhelmed with all the responsibilities and things that they need to do. They have to deliver on the month performance, on the quarterly performance, on the year performance. They need to take care of the people. They need to make sure that the people are safe. And also they need to take care of the particularities of the priorities of whatever they are in production and sales or whatever. And so I think sometimes it's overwhelming when you talk about diversity and inclusion and say, okay, you are a leader of a group of people and you need to be doing this and this and that. And I think it is very important that we help the middle management on this. First of all, they need to understand why we are doing this. So we need to understand the purpose. I'm a big fan of the trilogy of purpose, mastering, and autonomy. And so if you really explain the purpose of these and what are the results that we're going to have by applying this, and you give the tool for them to master the program and do something, and also you provide the autonomy, because, I think it's important that, you cannot have the same thing in every part of the organization, in every country, or even in different sections or functions in the same company, in the same country, because, you can have differences. Your people could be different. It may be different that when you have people in Texas and people in the Middle East, and it's different. So you need to provide that autonomy. So, but then, the tools and educations are critical. And I think it's important to help them to understand, because, one of the most common questions when you are putting this program in the face of the middle manager is, okay, I understand I got to do diversity. I have to have a diverse team. But what do you want? You want quality performance, or you want diversity in my team? And I think obviously this is a bias from people, because, when you do diversity and inclusion, you never ever compromise on the quality and the potential of the people that you are recruiting. And you need to understand there are great people with great potential in all of the places. And so I think it's important for them to understand that they cannot, this is not about, one thing or another thing. Is, bringing diversity and inclusion to upgrade the performance of the organization. And that is not easy. You need to work hard to do it. And it's important, the understanding and the help. If you don't help them, it's going to be very tough for the middle manager, given all the priorities. Also, the top management need to understand that some of the people, some of the leaders with the understanding the purpose, helping on the mastering and providing autonomy, they will go, but some others don't. And so the top of the company need to be ready to make sometimes tough decisions, because, otherwise things are not going to be improving the way that is planned. But it's not easy, and they require a lot of help.
And it requires a cultural change too, because you've been doing something today, and the culture will have to modify. And in order to modify, you will need the new leaders. So Adele, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think really this is also right, like again, the dance with the internal and external, right? Because the world is changing, and we talked about like the new generations that are coming, the new people in the workforce, what they expect to see when they're joining, right? Like a company, who are the new consumers of your products. When we're thinking about that, and you think about the world outside, and then you then try to, right, like incorporate that inside, it needs to have, right, like the change needs to cut across all of this. It needs to be top leadership. It needs to, of course, include middle management. And to me, really, I have lived that from experience. If you really don't have your human resources, talent, right, like cultural departments really aligned and empowered to make sure that you are then having all the training, education, and also, right, like really changing practices on a daily basis, then you are not going to see this big cultural change that it's needed. And one of the things that it's really, was thinking here, we did not touch on that, but it's really important to know that, right, like a lot of times you're talking about these biases. And I think I tried to make this point in the first question. They're really structural, right, like coming from structural problems. It's not, right, like an individualized matter that if you change one person or even two or a group, you're going to change it. That's why it's so complex, right? We're dealing with really past, right, like deep systems that are really ingrained, that we have all been immersed on. So that's why we need this diverse and complex approach to deal with it all. And culture is at the core of it.
And it takes time to change these systems. And it takes seeing systems to be able to change systems. So the culture will change over time. And there are some aspects of training that are very important. I see some of the questions are around that, but let me ask Enang. Enang, you have already curated webinars and workshops for leaders in companies and for entrepreneurs. How effective are those? And what are the do's and don'ts there?
Absolutely. So there are actually two things that I was thinking about even just as the conversation was going, where just thinking about things from an equity perspective and the history behind how certain people or certain social groups come into a company, there's a tendency for people of certain social identities to be stuck in that middle management level. And sometimes the problem isn't the middle management at that point. It's then the leadership of that organization adjusting their views on who can advance into that smaller caucus of leadership. So the problem could be on either end of that spectrum, on either like middle management not being willing to take on the responsibility of starting to enforce those changes, but it could also be that management's really bought in and they're engaged, and then they just don't have the support of leadership to really make meaningful difference across. Then when it comes into training and actually implementing those things, typically the initial reaction that I get is people being very uncomfortable, because these aren't conversations that we have on a regular day. These aren't, prior to last year, there are not very many companies that were including conversations on race and diversity and making sure that inclusion was at the forefront of their strategy. And now all of a sudden we're all talking about it, and everyone feels like they have to come out with, you know, a brand statement that showcases their engagement and their support for a community. So there's a lot of discomfort, especially when it comes to people who are corporate innovators or entrepreneurs, in how they start to engage with something that up until this point they haven't had to engage with a whole lot. But then as we start to have more authentic conversation, we allow people fail, but we make it safe for people to fail, where we create these spaces where, okay, you're coming here to learn. And because you've taken that intentional step to learn, it's okay for you to say the wrong thing here. And let's figure it out and let's correct it together. So that when you're stepping into that position with your organization, one, you're coming from a place of knowing, and two, you're coming from a place of empathy, because now you actually understand the systems behind the issue, and you're not just putting a bandage over the actual problem. So what I've realized with some of the trainings that I've done is just that slow moving transition between a lot of resistance and people feeling very uncomfortable to engage with the topic, or feeling defensive and like they have to make sure that everyone knows that they are not bad, and then slowly transitioning into a place where people then feel safe to fail, but ask vulnerable questions that can lead to more understanding.
Thank you, Enang. I know Pedro has a good example about training and creating the Center for Training, but let me read some of the questions we have from our audience so we can start also answering some of them already. So Daniela was asking us, we have so many nuances and opportunities to start engaging organizations towards diversity, inclusion, and equity. How can we choose or select which areas of diversity, inclusion, and equity we should start working with inside companies? So that's one. The other one's more about training, from Sibeli Salviato. What do you think about training and bring some awareness and care to those minorities who sometimes think that they have to overwork to compensate from a perceived weakness, ethnicity, gender, accent, different cultural backgrounds? I ask that because in my coaching experience, I noticed a lot of anxiety coming from those kinds of thoughts, as well as a lack of self-esteem and self-value. And most of my work has been to help them to stand by themselves and value the differences they bring to the table. So those are two questions more related to how to start and the kind of support in terms of training. There's also one from Jasmine Amory here. The pandemic has deeply increased social inequalities and exclusion. In Brazil, for example, a recent study showed that the number of billionaires increased to 65, while almost 20 million people are suffering from hunger. So what could companies and how could they be more proactive to reduce inequalities? Is it acceptable an executive can earn 660 times the average salary of the company? And you know, this is one example here she's mentioning to us. And then there is an anonymous attendee that's saying, I think that companies that adopt diversity and inclusion are teaching respect each other when it should be a basic teaching that comes from family. In other words, we are somehow taught with some prejudices. What do you think? I'm not against this movement, I'm just trying to go deeper. And then last but not least, a question from Vicente Teixeira of how to prove to the company the impact of diversity on the company's performance and financial returns. All right, Pedro, I was going to go to you about the training experience you had at Dow. Maybe you want to do that and touch on some of the questions here as well, and then we'll go to Adele and Enang.
Yeah, I think very interesting questions. I think the first thing that I believe that you need to do is to make an assessment on where you are. And there are two things that you need to do. One is to compare the profile of your organization versus the other similar companies in your area of responsibility and in your country. And then, you know, you comparing those notes in terms of, you know, what is the composition of your organization. You will see if you are, first of all, in tune with the population diversity that you have in your country, and how far, or how well, or how bad you with other companies that are similar to you in terms of size and so on and so forth. This is a reference that you need to have, which is an external reference. And that will give you a lot of data on that. The other reference is the inside, the climate of the organization. And then, you know, there are many ways of taking the temperature of the organization. There are some of them that, in fact, are designed for the company to show that everything is fine. And there are some others that are going deeper and allow the people to talk and write or whatever. And you know, so then the companies, the top leadership understand really what is going on in the organization. So the people need to feel safe and need to be obviously an anonymous survey for you to be credible and for you to make sure that the people are going to say what they feel. And then, you know, you need to make sure that you're going to do something about it. because otherwise the next survey you're going to do, you know, you're not going to have a lot of people, you know, giving you insights. So with the external parameters and with the internal climate of the organization, you need to put together a clear program, and to test that program, you need to work with the different networks. By the way, if you don't have the networks, you need to create them, because you know this is an important part of whatever program. Because you know, as you were mentioning before with the Midas, I think people feel comfortable, people can exchange experiences, people can learn, and also it's a great source of learning for the leaders, going into those networks and understanding what's going on there, what are the issues and the pain points, and so you can act. But you know, I think that will be the sequence of you know, of fortunate events if you want to do an inclusion and diversity program, and then you know, obviously measure the results for that, and this is on a continuous basis. Training the leaders is very important, and it has to be very authentic and very deep, you know, and again, you know, open for the leaders to put on the table all the problems that they have, particularly the middle management, as we were talking before.
Thank you, Pedro. We have so many good examples to share, especially the one when we were creating the GLBTQ plus community. Like you said, if there is no network within the company, you have to create it. You have to start listening. And the example of your Institute for Training as well. We're going to have to finish here, guys, because this is almost the hour. But before we go, I would love for each one of you to use this final minutes to address some of the questions, but also leave a message of do or don't or both to our audience. So I will start with Enang. I will invert the order here. Start with Enang and then go backwards. Enang, please, your final message.
Awesome. I'm going to try to answer the question with my do and don't, because the one question that really stood out to me was Sibeli's question on the experience of minorities having a lot of imposter syndrome participating in organizations. And what my do for diversity would be here is facilitating culture change. We've spoken about that a lot through the conversation so far. And ultimately, it comes down to the culture in the organization that drives those feelings. Because when you feel like you don't belong, it's hard for you to participate effectively in that system. And so when we create cultures around how we support people, how we ask questions that optimize the value that people bring as opposed to how they're bringing that value, I think that that's ultimately something that's going to help organizations do better from a diversity perspective. And then for my don't, I would say don't tokenize people. That's one major pitfall with starting to have these conversations on diversity and expanding the pool of people that we have in our organizations. It's great if you have people of different races, backgrounds, creeds, whatever the case. However, if you're only having them there so you can say that you hit your target, you're missing the point. And so it's a challenge for all of us to really look into our intentions on why we're inviting different people to the table and allowing them bring the fullness of the value that they have to offer into those conversations.
Thank you, so inspiring. Adele, your message?
Yes, so I'm thinking here what to do, and I'm going to repeat myself from our first conversation with the risk of sounding like a broken record, but I think the do is really get used to feeling uncomfortable, right? And Enang mentioned this, we all said this before, like there is the initial part of this conversation and this process, right? Like for all of us does require, right? Like us being uncomfortable, and actually take that as a measure of success. If you are feeling that feeling of like, I'm not comfortable with this, it's pushing me in different directions, I'm not right, like in my safe space, it means that you are doing the work that is necessary for you to do. Like examining our own biases is not easy. So really, right, like do consider that for all of this. And then for don'ts, I think it's really the tokenizing, but also the easy answers, right? As we said, right, like it's really, really hard to personalize this or individualize this. Those are complex problems that we're talking about like systemic change here. So then they need to be happening at multiple levels. So do not go for like the 5 easy steps, because they are never really the right way. And if you wanted to change the outputs, you need to change your inputs where you're starting with.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Adele. Pedro, your final message?
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression to the audience that, everything that we've been talking here is easy to make, is hard work. And when I'm thinking about the hard work for leaders to do this, I remember I had the privilege to meet with Edwin Moses. He was a phenomenal athlete in North America many years ago. And he was majoring in physics and engineering. And he decided to start doing something with his body. And then, he became a phenomenal athlete on the 400 meters hurdles track discipline. And using all the knowledge that he was getting in the university, he developed a way of doing the race with 13 steps between the 2 hurdles, while normally it was 15 steps. And then Edwin was able to win 107 finals during 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days. And I have the privilege to meet the guy and with another group of people, and we were asking how you did it. And he said, every year that I was a champion, I was thinking that, my competitors, they were improving and making more perfections on the way that they were running. And so I needed to be better next year. So I started in January all over again to be a champion again. So, and this is valid for the diversity and inclusion implementation plan and for anything that you do as a leader. That, don't think that because you have a great year, you're going to have a great career as a leader. Normally, leadership is not a picture, it's a movie that you need to have a lot of work to get a happy ending. So, and this is valid for diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love it. This is a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate your time, Enang, Adele, Pedro, to be here with us, and all our audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to learn more about systems thinking and how to navigate complexity and deal with issues like diversity, inclusion, and others, join us at the BRIA Institute for the CEO Meet and Master program, where we are going to be talking more about this. We are going to be stretching you to go from linear thinking to more systems thinking and be able to have this powerful skill to navigate complexity as a leader. So thank you again very much for being with us, and stay tuned. We'll have more coming up. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.